So these guys have been marching since early morning. They marched about 26 miles straight just to get to the battlefield. And then after a brief rest, they had to march possibly another 5 miles to get into position to attack. Then they begin to attack. So at that point, they had marched probably well over 30 miles in the heat, in 80-degree heat. So they're coming from that direction, and they actually wind up climbing up Big Round Top because they're chasing these sharpshooters. That's 305 feet up. This is after a 30-mile march all day. They're climbing that with their gear, 300 feet up. And Oates had detached about 20 men to fill canteens because it was a hot day. These guys get lost and wind up getting captured. So they've marched 30 miles, they've climbed Big Round Top, and none of them have canteens. They have no water. So you have guys continually just falling out from pure exhaustion.
Yeah.
They just can't physically go any further, and some even just fall over dead because they just, they've reached the end. So he realizes that there's nobody up on Big Round Top, and he starts to see movements towards this direction. So he comes down the saddle from Big Round Top and starts coming up that direction. But they can't see the 20th Maine. 20th Maine had just gotten position maybe 10 minutes before they come up. So they're starting to come up from that way, and suddenly the 20th Maine unleashes their first volley. And the Alabamians said it was the worst volley they ever received. And as I was saying, once Oates gets a feel of the situation, he decides he wants to start coming around the left, because he wants to get on that flank and start rolling it up, just like you roll up a scroll. And Chamberlain sees this. He originally had his men in 2 ranks. And as he sees this flanking movement, he orders them to extend into just one long line instead of a double line. And he starts to bend that point back. And every time the Alabamians move further this way, he bends it back further. So the colors are there, and you have this V, but this V continues to squeeze in on itself. So really, as far as I can see from the maps, there were maybe 10, 12 feet in between the 2 sides of the V. But again, Vincent had said you must hold this position at all hazards, at all costs. But, I really feel for the 15th Alabama. They marched 30 miles, had no water. I've climbed Big Round Top. It's a height. It really wins you, even if you're in good shape. Then they got to come down, and then they're coming up here and coming into the fire of the 20th Maine. And they made about 4 rushes up and got repelled back down. So then they'd move down further and rush up and then withdraw back down. So it's kind of a back and forth motion. So you can only imagine how exhausted these guys were. This is over the course of 11, 12, 13 hours of almost constant marching, climbing, rushing, firing. So I wanted to give you a description from Oates' perspective, what he was seeing around here. He says, "My dead and wounded were nearly as great in number as those still on duty. They literally covered the ground. The blood stood in puddles in some places on the rocks. The ground was soaked with the blood of as brave of men as ever fell on the red field of battle." So, I feel like 20th Maine duly gets his respect, but I think Oates' Alabamians also deserve a great deal of respect. And then I wanted to take a quote from one of the 20th Maines that also paints a picture for you of what it was like at this spot. Private Theodore Garris says, "There was a terrible melody of cries, shouts, cheers, groans, prayers, curses, bursting shells, whizzing rifle bullets, and clanging steel. The air seemed to be alive with lead. The lines at times were so near each other that the hostile gun barrels almost touched. Colonel Oates' younger brother, Lieutenant John Oates, was hit and lay dying. Colonel Oates cried, 'Forward, my men, to the ledge.'" This would be the ledge. And he fires his revolver and leads another surge toward the Federal line 30 yards again. Again and again, this mad rush repeated, each time to be beaten off by the ever-thinning line that desperately clung to its ledge of rock. Chamberlain himself recalls, the edge of the conflict swayed to and fro with wild whirlpools and eddies. At times I saw around me more of the enemy than of my own men. Gaps opening, swallowing, closing again with a sharp, convulsive energy. All around was a strange, mingled roar. So, I mean, it was just pandemonium. They would push up and come within such close distances and blaze away and fall back. And you had hand to hand, there was just gaps opening. I mean, as I read it, and I think the movie does a pretty good job of showing that, just how chaotic it was and just how close Oates really came after all of that marching in the heat to knocking the 20th Maine off. And they were no joke. They were a hard fighting unit. Also, I wanted to read something that I came across. There was a sharpshooter in the 15th Alabama that wrote a letter to Chamberlain after the battle. In fact, I'll just paraphrase it for you, but he told him that at 2 different times in the battle, he had Chamberlain dead in his sights and was ready to pull the trigger. And he acknowledges, I was ready to take your life on 2 separate occasions. I had you dead to rights. But he said, I had this queer feeling come over that I ought not do it. And after the first time he hesitated, he kind of strengthened himself and checked himself because he just thought, this is crazy, this is cowardly. So the second time he got Chamberlain dead in his sights, had his finger on the trigger ready to pull, and he said, again, I had this queer notion that I ought not do it. And he took his finger off the trigger and he let Chamberlain continue on. He said he recognized him by his star and just by his conduct. So after the war, he's writing Chamberlain this letter saying, I had you twice, dead in my sights, could have killed you, and I can't explain to you why, but there was something in me that told me not to. And he actually confessed that I am glad I did not pull the trigger that day. What I know of Chamberlain after the war, he went on to serve as governor of Maine for 4 terms. He was previously professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College. He went on to be president. And, a brief story that just speaks to who he was when he was governor of Maine. One of his former soldiers, after the war, fell into a life of thievery, just could not readjust to society. And he was going to be hung or he was facing a long prison sentence, and somehow the matter came to Chamberlain's attention. And he recognized the soldier's name, and he worked it out so that he would be pardoned. And Chamberlain had this man come live with him on his estate, and he actually taught the man how to read and write, because he did not know how to read and write. So this man spent, I believe, a couple years literally living with Chamberlain, learning to read and write, and Chamberlain helped him then get back into society, and the man led a very productive life. But I feel like it really speaks to the different sides of Chamberlain, that was a real beautiful act of grace and redemption. And one last thing. Later in the war, there's a quote that one of his soldiers, one of his officers said of him. He said, General, you have the soul of a lion and the heart of a woman. And I was wrestling with this one about a week ago. This isn't one you were using, right, Doug? Okay, good.
No, the other stuff was, but go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I was hoping not. But I was thinking about that. Doesn't seem like that goes together, right? Soul of a lion, heart of a woman. And I was just kind of thinking on that and thought, I have to confess that I'd say my girlfriend does a much better job of loving than I do. In fact, I'd say many women I know do a much better job of loving. And I was just thinking on what does it mean to be a man? Is there some balance that should be there, that we should be warriors and we should have the soul of a lion, but is there not something else that should balance that out? And I thought of Jesus. He was referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. In the final battle, he'll be leading the hosts into battle. Clearly a warrior. But I also know of the time he sits and weeps over Jerusalem and says, I would have gathered you together like a hen gathers up her chicks. And you see a tenderness to him that maybe we would consider a female quality. But, I've studied many men in the Civil War, and I think Chamberlain still stands out to me as, I think, the best model of true masculinity, because I saw pictures of his tenderness, his grace, his mercy, but he also had the soul of a lion and was a warrior to the end. And he actually achieved corps status, was Major General, and he was the only one that Ulysses S. Grant asked to oversee the formal surrender of the Confederates at Appomattox. And as we were talking earlier, he even showed grace to the Confederates, to his adversaries, when they surrendered. So I just think as we stand here today, we definitely are standing not only at the spot where great deeds were done, but also where great men were. And Oates, in his own right, went on after the war to be a congressman and become governor of his state. So there was leaders here, and they showed leadership qualities, but they also took that back into civilian life. Especially Chamberlain. Also of note, he could speak 7 different languages, and I guess was a master of accents for those 7 languages. He even used that in the war to trick some Confederates because he could mimic their southern accent so well. So, he was professor of rhetoric, intellect, but yet he felt it was his duty to join up, and he goes on to really be a great warrior and great leader. So I just think those stories, and then when you think that he should have been killed, I would assume that Alabamian would have shot and killed him twice. So I can only presume as to what that queer sensation was that stayed his finger on that trigger. I don't know if that was God or can't say, but I know that he did go on to do great things. So as that man said, I'm glad I did not pull that trigger that day.